Welcome to today's pre-recorded webinar based on CAEP legislation to provide new administrators of the CAEP program a better understanding of the CAEP legislation. Neil Kelly of the CAEP office will provide this legislative overview. Neil?
Thank you, Veronica. Hi, this is Neil, and today I'm going to give you a little overview of the legislation and the ed code for the California Adult Ed program. And so I'm going to go to the next slide and show you, actually we don't have an agenda. So basically we'll be going through the various ed code that has been put into trailer bills and the original AB 104 legislation, and this is the foundation of our program. As you go through this, you'll see there is a foundation, but it's not a deep foundation, and so that's why we rely on existing, if you're a K-12 CDE education code for adult schools, and if you're a non-credit program at a community college, we would rely on the community college Title IV and those regulations and ed code in addition to the CAEP language. So with that said, let's get started. So CAEP, what is it? So CAEP funding goes out to 71 statewide consortia. They're based on the 72 community college district boundaries. We do have 2 community college districts combining down in San Jose. So instead of 72, we have 71. This effort is led by the CAEP office staff, which consists of leadership from the Department of Education and the Chancellor's Office, Community College Chancellor's Office. So the mission here is to for K-12 and community colleges to work together with workforce and education partners and all the stakeholders, which would include your libraries, your county services, your workforce, your one-stops, your CBOs, who else? Legal services, refugee service, you name it. To ensure that students are prepared for life, for work, and to support their families, strengthen communities, no matter where they are in their educational journey. Because if you're coming into adult education as a new administrator or director, you'll learn that our students have a different type of journey than the traditional student that you see coming out of high school into the community college. They have families to support. They're working multiple jobs. Some have some legal issues. Some might be undocumented. Some could have barriers with childcare, transportation, or dealing with things like alcohol or drug dependency. Some might be coming out of prison or jail. Most of them, 99%, are low income, so we have poverty issues. We have language issues. We have reading issues as far as literacy levels. A lot of them don't have their high school diploma. So a different educational journey than the traditional K-12 path. So let's talk a little bit about a brief history of our program. So in 2013, the Chancellor's Office, referred to as CCCCO, that's California Community College Chancellor's Office, and CDE, California Department of Education, worked together on AB 86 to develop a new approach. So what AB 86 was, K-12 adult schools had been flexed, and they were coming out of flexibility, meaning all their funds were pretty much up to their district to decide how to spend those funds. And so it pretty much decimated the adult education program. I think it was up to, at a certain point, state funding was over $700 million. If you included the federal funding, it was over $800 million. And with flexibility, that dropped probably, in most cases, by half, in some cases 60%. In other cases, the adult schools closed down. So Governor Brown originally had a solution of just turning this program over to the community colleges. And so there was a backlash and a lot of legwork at the Capitol. And the result of that advocacy for K-12 adult education was AB 86. And so AB 86 was kind of a compromise between the old way of the adult schools and the way that Governor Brown wanted to turn it over to the colleges. And so AB 86 was the Chancellor's Office and CDE, and at the local level, the colleges and the K-12 adult and county office program serving adults working together on a regional approach. And so, let's see. So the group, we had a work group made up of not only people at the state level, but we had people at the local level. Some of these people are still involved, but I think there were like 4 on each side. It was a good group, and so out of this, the regional consortia were established, and going forward into 2014, we had a planning grant for $25 million, and those planning grants developed the regional plans and how they would be structured. And as a result of that regional planning, in 15-16, the state legislature allocated $500 million to the Chancellor's Office in conjunction with CDE for the Adult Education Block Grant, which has turned into and renamed the California Adult Education Program, which is currently close to $540 million as we go into 1920. Okay, so let's start looking at the Ed Code. And so the first thing you would do is if you go into the Cal Adult Ed website, that's caladulted.org, and you click on governance and you click on legislation, it'll take you to a Ed Code link, which is displayed here, that has all the pertinent adult education Ed Code, and that's just for the CAEP, or in the old days AEBG. So additional Ed Code would be found at if you're a community college, it would be found in your community college regs and education code. If you're a K-12 or county office, it would be Oh, when? Do you want me to keep going?
No, stay still for right now.
Okay. Okay. Which button? This side?
Okay, you're good.
Okay.
Neil, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Okay, we're good.
Okay.
If you just go back to the previous slide and start over,
Okay.
at that point,
Okay.
and cut and paste it back in.
Okay. You were kind of cutting out there, so um, all right. So just tell me when to start.
Okay, you can start now.
Okay. So let's look at this slide, the establishment of consortia. And so this is the initial ed code that establishes the 71 CAEP regional consortia. And so when the chancellor at the community colleges and the superintendent at Department of Education got together, they agreed upon dividing the state into the adult ed regions using the following criteria: economic and demographic factors, the ease of using regions to distribute funds to other state programs, as far as the presence of adult ed providers that have demonstrated effectiveness. So all those factors went in, and so they agreed upon using the community college district boundaries as the regional vehicle for the delivery of adult ed services, and the fact that each region would be a consortia of adult ed providers. So the next slide is important because from that consortia, you have to determine your membership, how you manage it, and what those requirements are. And so Education Code 84905 talks about the details of being a member. It describes which organizations can be members of a consortia, conditions for joining a consortia, who can represent your consortia, requirements for decision making, and fund distribution. These are all critical, and there's a lot more detail in this Ed Code section 84905. And this will be important for you as a consortia director or lead to know if an adult ed provider wants to join as a member. Can they join? Is it a requirement or is it not? So if you look at that Ed Code, really it's the K-12, county office, JPA, or community college districts, have a right to be a member of a consortia. Now, it's up to your consortia and its membership to consider other adult ed providers as members, but that's your choice. And you should have decision-making bylaws that govern those type of choices that you have to make. And so a lot of consortia have put in, in addition to 84905, they've put in more detail on who can be a member, what are the conditions for joining a membership, as far as who can represent. It's an official appointed member from the local board of your district, but that local official that's appointed has final say-so. So that means that official doesn't have to go back to the local board when making a decision. They represent the district board in consortia level decisions, and when the decision is made, it's final, so it doesn't go back to the district for further discussion. And so that's why it's critical when they appoint someone to the consortia to represent them as the official member that they make that right decision. And then there's a lot of requirements in 84905 related to public meetings, and we also include, it's not in this ed code, but Brown Act is also governing our public meetings as well, so you might want to get familiar with that. And so there's a lot covered in this section. So this is an important section to understand. And so here's a little chart to help you understand how this all fits together. And so, like I said, it's an important ed code section, so that's why we have a infographic. And so the membership and governance, all that information leads to or impacts your operations. So once you decide who can be a member, the public meeting requirements, the decision-making requirements, your bylaws, all that stuff, that guides your operations. So you see the direct impact there between membership and governance and operations. And so your members are making decisions on day-to-day operational type stuff, and that impacts that. And so those operational requirements also impact your public meeting and information that you share that are part of the ed code related to public meetings and Brown Act requirements. And so that's why you should be familiar with that, be familiar with Brown Act, run your meetings accordingly, post it in a public place, have adult ed providers and the public available to make comment, and all those things related to your operational program. And the whole encompassing part of this is transparency. And so we want to make sure the public meetings, all the information is shared, the bylaws are available for everybody to review and know how the consortia operates. This impacts the operation, and with that transparency, there's no surprises. And so that transparency guides how you bring members in, how you govern your region, and how you operate on a daily basis. And you can see that in Launchboard, which is open to the public, so everybody can look at the data. Nova is open to not the public, but all other members, so everyone can see each other's budgets and see how everybody's spending and allocations. And so the key to this whole effort is that transparency. So let's move on to the next slide. So planning, and this is in the Ed Code 84906, and this is a big effort too, along with the day-to-day operational, how you do your bylaws, run your public meetings, operate your programs. But to get there, you have to have the plan, and we have a kind of elaborate planning system. And so there's a 3-year plan that's called out in the legislation and Ed Code, and an annual plan. And the way these work is, in this section, there's a planning cycle, and it describes what's to be included in that planning cycle. And it emphasizes in this Ed Code that the planning should be based on community need and regional input from stakeholders and the public. And so every 3 years, the consortia starts a process for their 3-year plan. And their 3-year plan is a long-range strategic plan that guides them for those next 3 years. And that's usually due in June, and that's every 3 years in June. So we have one coming up in 2019, which will be due June 7th, and then the next one will be due 3 years from now. And so once that 3-year plan is in place, after you do all the legwork, get the community need, get the regional input, look at your data, talk to your members, talk to your adult ed providers, talk to the public, talk to the students. Once you have that plan in place, and every year in August 15th, you will submit an annual plan that is based on that 3-year plan. And so the annual plan covers kind of your objectives or strategies that you're going to be focusing on for the upcoming year. And so if you submit a plan like this August 15th, that would cover the 1920 year based on the recently submitted 3-year plan. And so next year in 2020, you would submit a plan for 2020-2021 school year, and that would be covering strategies and objectives for that year. And so what happens with that plan once it's submitted in August and certified by all the members, then the members come in September and they develop a work plan based on that annual plan, which is based on the 3-year plan. And so the members will select certain strategies or objectives that they want to work on during the year. They don't have to select all of them, but they will select a few that are going to be their focus, and then they build their budget based on that work plan. And those are usually submitted at the end of September. And so that's kind of the planning cycle. And then, so once you submit that work plan at the district level, then every quarter you report out your expenditures on that plan. And you do that for 4 quarters, and that takes you up to the following year, and then you do another annual plan, and then the district does another work plan based on that annual plan. So that cycle continues for the next 3 years until you go ahead and submit your new 3-year plan, and then that kickstarts it all over again with the annual plan, and then the district work plan and their budgets based on that, which result in the fiscal reporting on a quarterly basis. So hopefully that's clear on the planning. There was some additional planning guidance that was put in under 84916 Ed Code, and it talks about for planning, the members and participants that receive funding should be included in this process, and we have that. So when you go into NOVA, each year when we ask you to report your program area expenses, we'll ask you how much money are you using from the Jail Ed Fund. So that's Adults in Correctional Facilities. That's a K-12 program. We'll also ask, how much of the funding are you using for WIOA 2, which is a federal adult literacy program. Perkins, LCFF, which is local control formula funding, community college non-credit apportionment, as well as CalWORKs, and any state funds for adult literacy or career online high school programs. So those fund sources are critical to the planning as well. Consortia, I guess, is started in 1819 for planning, and so that's just another additional Ed Code site for your planning efforts. And so here's a nice infographic to kind of pull it all together, kind of what I was saying. So if you look at the planning cycle, it says uses a planning cycle driven by community need and public input, including 3-year plan, annual plans, work plans, member work plans. So number 1 would be the 3-year plan, like I said. Number 2 is the annual plan. And number 3 is the member work plans and budgets. And then 4 is your course offerings and student outcomes. So that's when you run your program during the school year. And I guess I would also add onto that is the quarterly reporting of your data, your student outcomes, and course offerings. That would be your student data. If you're K-12, you would report that through TopsPro. If you're a college, you would report that through your MIS system. And so that would be that. And then your financial part, that's on a quarterly basis as well. That gets reported in NOVA. And so hopefully this kind of summarized what I was talking about and puts that planning Ed Code into perspective and looks at our various systems. We have our student data collection system. We also have our financial tracking systems. And so they all revolve around kind of this planning cycle. So let's move on to the next slide. And this kind of reinforces at the state level how expenditures and allocations and apportionment are distributed and what the requirements are around that. And that covers kind of a series of Ed Code sections, 84907 to 84912. Things that we talk about are the apportionment and expenditure requirements, key dates for preliminary and final allocations. So when you see the preliminary allocations, say at the end of February. That's based on the governor's budget. So we release a preliminary allocation at the end of February, and then you do the CFAD, which is your allocation schedule, which is due in May, and then the governor signs the budget usually at the end of June, and then we do a final allocation, and then we attempt to disperse funds starting at the end of August. Sometimes that doesn't always work out, but that's kind of the schedule, and that's what the Ed Code says. This Ed Code also has key factors in determining regional need. It lists the 6 factors that we used in determining the regional need formula on how funds were allocated to the 71 regional consortia. And there were things like adult population, literacy levels, English spoken at home, unemployment, household poverty, and I think the last one was high school diploma. And so there's also parameters for apportionment of moving funds forward. And so all that's covered in these sections. And so here's another nice infographic. And so if you look at community need on the far left side, those are things like, those are the metrics we're tracking: educational attainment, employment. These are, let me rephrase that. Community need are those formula topics that I talked about that went into the formula, or the key components. So educational attainment would be like high school diploma, employment, and so that would be the unemployment rate, adult population size, poverty, which would be household poverty, adult literacy level, we use the 7th grade reading level, and then ESL, that would be from the English spoken at home. And this was all from the census, and we updated it with the American Community Survey. And so that community need fed into the formula funding, which each region got a share of, and that drives your budget and planning, those allocation amounts that you receive, which also drives, if you go back to that planning infographic, drives your course and service offerings, and then we track those student outcomes as well as those expenditures in our different systems. So just another way to look at this, but I think it's important to have these infographics to put it in perspective, because sometimes it's a little confusing on how this stuff all relates, but I think this does a pretty good job of that. Okay, so use of funds. You'll see if you go on our website under policy, we do have some guidance on use of funds, fiscal management guide, which is all based on sections like this one, 84913. This one really just covers the 7 programs that you can use your funding on. So these are restricted funds. These funds are restricted to these 7 program areas. And so if you look at it, it's elementary and secondary ed, which are either basic skills in the community college world, or adult basic ed, adult secondary ed in the K-12 world. And then we have your ESL program under programs for immigrants. That would include your citizenship, your EL civics, as well as ESL classes. And then I'm going to skip down to kind of what we call K-12 success, or it could be the old parenting program. It's programs for adults, including but not limited to older adults, that are primarily designed to develop knowledge and skills to assist elementary and secondary school children to succeed academically in school. And so what that is those are adults working with elementary and secondary students to succeed. And so that could come in a variety of forms and models. And so we're kind of still exploring that. And then programs for adults with disabilities would be another program. And then if you look at the 3 remaining, that would be the 3rd bullet, program for adults, including but not limited to older adults that are primarily related to entry or re-entry into the workforce. That would be part of a CTE overarching umbrella. So that one, the one called Programs in Career Tech Education that are short-term in nature and have a high employment potential. That's also kind of a career tech program, as well as the last one, programs offering pre-apprenticeship training activities conducted in conjunction with one or more apprenticeship programs approved by Division of Apprenticeship Standards for occupation and geographic area. And so those would kind of fall under CTE as well. So if you want to look at use of funds simplistically, you have your adult basic ed, you have your secondary ed, you have your ESL, you have your CTE, you have your K-12 success or parenting programs, and you have your adults with disabilities. Excuse me. And so those would be kind of your main programs, and then those sub-programs would be the workforce reentry, the short-term vocational, and your pre-apprenticeship. It also covers use of funds for indirect costs and administrative costs, but I would go to the fiscal management guide to get examples and a clearer understanding of how indirect works at the member level, which would be at the district level, and how administrative costs work at the consortia level. So we've kind of teased that out in greater detail in the fiscal management guide, which is on the website. Okay, so talking about fund distribution and management, that's section 84914, section 1 of that. And so this talks about the CFAD requirements, related to development of a distribution schedule, and we kind of talked about that. The preliminary allocation comes out from the governor's budget. We release that at the end of February. You give us an allocation schedule by the beginning of May, which is the CFAD process, and then we take that and allocate funds through either a fiscal agent or direct funded, depending on what your consortia has chosen. And so there is also Ed Code in the section of how a consortia can decrease funds to a member with cause, and there's 3 causes. And then it also added a requirement in trailer bill language that now is part of Ed Code that requires funds to be deposited in a separate adult ed fund account by school districts. And so this protects the adult ed fund so it doesn't get swept up if you put it in a separate adult ed fund account, not in the general fund. Okay, so let's see, moving right along. And so then there's also in section 84917, there's reporting requirements at the state level. And so every year the state, chancellor's office, and the superintendent, that's community colleges and Department of Education, they're required to submit to the legislature a preliminary report and a final report describing the use of funds and the outcomes for adults statewide and by each consortia. And so those reports are usually submitted in November is the preliminary report, usually due in early November. And then the final report is due in March of the following year. And so those are the reports that you would see on the website, and we share that out with all the members and consortia directors and leads. And so the last big section, and this is a huge section, is 84920. This Ed Code lays out the whole data and accountability structure and the metrics for CAEP. It did describe, which is the data and accountability funding, which is sunsetting this year, describe that. But more importantly, it highlights the student data metrics that we use to capture and assess consortia effectiveness. And so that's what you report into TOPS Pro if you're K-12 or county office, and that's what you report if you're a non-credit program in the community college system. And so let's see with greater detail. Well, I don't think we have more greater detail, but if you go back and you can look at this 84920, you can look at the metrics. So that would be things like educational functioning gains, skill gains, high school diploma, high school equivalencies, certificates, degrees, wage gain, employment gains, transition. And when we mean transition, we're talking about transition to ASE, transition to CTE, transition to transfer level coursework at the college, the post-secondary. So a lot of data has gone into that. When we look back at this slide about the reports, That's the data that we pull into these reports to the legislature, is all based on this 84920 ed code. Okay, and then lastly, this slide talks about how ed code is updated, and it just kind of talks about the development of the governor's budget, and then the budget is submitted usually by the second week of January. We get that preliminary allocation. In that, it usually has the amount for adult education, the CAEP program. We get that out to you divided by regional consortia, and then we follow the budget hearings up until June 15th when it's put on the floor of the legislature for a vote. And during that time, you also have the CFAD due by early May. And so once the governor approves it, and that's usually by the end of June or July 1st when it's enacted, there can be some changes, budget changes. There might be separate laws introduced, trailer bills, and we've had quite a few trailer bills introduced that have imposed additional ed code or language on our program. And you can see that on the legislative website for caladulted.org under governance legislation. It tracks all the trailer bills. And so this is kind of that process of where that additional language gets put in for our ed code, and that we put it into our guidance so you can follow that. Okay, I think with that, that's our last slide. So to learn more, you can go to the link or go onto the website and go under legislation or governance and then legislation and peruse that. You can go to our program guidance, which kind of takes us and goes a little deep dive. We also have the fiscal management guidance, which talks about allowable activities and traces back to education code. And so that's a good foundation to have. So once you become familiar with the education code and how this program is run, then you can get familiar with the program guidance and the fiscal management guidance, which talks about kind of more day-to-day type stuff. And then if you go back to those infographics that we talked about today or reviewed, kind of gives you kind of a high level, more visual of how this program operates with the planning, how planning feeds into operations, and how that relates to governance. So a lot of kind of components and cycles are working here, but mostly I would stress learn the ed code, make sure the ed code is reflected in your bylaws and how you're making decisions, and that would drive how you're operating and how you're planning and how you're spending your money. So feel free to review this again or ask questions to TAP. They are very knowledgeable on this subject and can find out. We have so many questions that come in. We have a database full of questions and answers that they can point you to on a variety of education code questions. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this webinar, and we look forward to you coming on board and being a valuable member of our consortia network, and we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.